As part of a new culture war, similar bills have been introduced in at least 20 other states.
Well, what do we have here? An in-depth report about the pitfalls of transgender healthcare? It would be a shame if someone completely took it out of context, ignored the entire premise of the report, and used it to further an anti-trans narrative based on nothing but my shallow feelings. That would be really bad. What's up everybody, Hunter Avalone here, and welcome back to another video. I first want to give a special thanks to my generous patrons for supporting the channel. You may have noticed the quality of my videos have been improving, and that's because of my generous patrons. If you want special rewards and to help the channel, consider hitting the link below and become a patron today. Okay, the shameless ad is over. Prepare to get your triggered tighty whities in a wad, because now we are talking about the recent 60 Minutes episode aired a few days ago by CBS. Reporter Leslie Stahl delivered a unique story about the pitfalls of trans healthcare, going as far as to interview multiple detransitioners, people who transitioned, were unhappy, and transitioned back, detailing their experience being treated by various gender clinics and healthcare workers. Although this story was supposed to focus on healthcare for trans people, it was the detransitioners specifically who garnered attention, especially from conservatives. And in fairness, you can't really blame the conservatives for getting super excited about this one. I mean, one of the interviews from the episode that was circulating all over Twitter encompasses everything the conservatives have nightmares about. The girl saying it was too easy to transition and how she even felt pressured by society to be a boy. The reason that conservatives get so excited about these one-off examples is, of course, because it's all they have. They don't have numbers and facts about the overall regret rates for transgender people and the importance of gender transition for so many of them. All those facts oppose their worldview. So these anecdotes from a few people saying scary stuff about transitioning is truly the only argument they have left. The first part of this clip focuses on a girl who had gender dysphoria, talking about how the process was too easy.
They asked me, so why do you want to go on testosterone? And I said, well, being a woman just isn't working for me anymore. And they said, okay.
So that was that. You got your prescription for testosterone.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Next, Leslie Stahl interviews 4 other detransitioners, hearing their stories about how the process was too easy and they didn't feel as if they'd received enough pushback.
I didn't get enough pushback on transitioning. I went for 2 appointments, and after the second one, I had my letter to go get on cross-sex hormones.
2 visits? That's it?
When it comes to these detransitioners, that's their experience, and I don't think it should be taboo to talk about people who regretted their treatment. When it comes to any kind of treatment, there will be some who have regrets. The reason this subject is seen as taboo is because most of the time, we aren't actually having a conversation about some people and their experience with detransitioning. Anti-trans lunatics try and use regret as a proxy to argue that trans people are invalid or that the treatment for gender dysphoria should be disregarded. This is of course faulty logic. I mean, that would be like if I told you that I had some friends who, after getting on antidepressants, became more depressed. That's of course a risk doctors should discuss, but it doesn't mean antidepressants don't work. What's more, this clip is being taken out of context to support anti-trans sentiments, despite the original story supporting a pro-trans position. The report in its entirety is about trans healthcare and how it sometimes falls short. The beginning of the episode focuses on the southern states passing anti-trans healthcare legislation. It also features an interview with a gender therapist explaining how the legislation has no rational basis.
Is there any medical rationale for this legislation, in your opinion?
No, there is not.
It's quite interesting to see people cherry-picking one part of a source which they believe supports their narrative, when the entire source, as a whole, is opposed to their narrative. Do you view the source as credible only when it supports your beliefs? Next, the episode focuses on the WPATH guidelines, which indicate that surgery shouldn't be done before the age of 18, and that in order to undergo treatment, therapists must be involved. Here's the key detail that you won't see in any of these viral clips conservatives are sharing. During an interview with Dr. Erica Anderson, Anderson, who sits on the WPATH board, she explains that because of the fact that transgender healthcare has progressed so quickly, there is not yet an accreditation to work in the field. Because of this, clinicians aren't always well trained and don't always abide by the guidelines.
Dr. Anderson, who sits on the board of WPATH, says that their guidelines are not always followed by clinicians who are not well trained.
This oversight may lead to misdiagnosing and rushing procedures, which can lead to higher rates of regret and detransition, which again does not prove that transitioning in and of itself is inherently not an effective treatment. The reason this episode focused on detransitioners is because they were direct victims of these guidelines not being followed. The episode is not about how being trans is bad because detransitioners, it's about how when healthcare isn't up to par, it can result in the actual guidelines being ignored and can contribute to misdiagnosis and sometimes detransitioners. Even the clip conservatives have been sharing around admits this right out.
And so she detransitioned by going off testosterone and then went back to the clinic, and she says complained to the doctor that the process didn't follow the WPATH guidelines.
It's interesting because if you look at who's behind the attempts to curtail healthcare for trans people, it's Republicans. Yet they're also the ones who are constantly crying about regret rates and detransitioners. Weird. It seems that if you wanted less detransitioning or regret rates, you would be in support of better healthcare and research into the best treatment for trans people. But remember, conservatives don't actually want that. They just want trans people to go away. The guidelines exist for a reason, and the fact that some of these people were victimized by the guidelines being ignored is absolutely tragic. But again, this doesn't mean being trans is a phase, and it also doesn't mean the treatment for those struggling with gender dysphoria is bad. Medical malpractice can happen during any type of treatment, but it doesn't mean that specific treatment is inherently wrong. Dr. Anderson says the stories of detransitioners mean the trans community as a whole needs more and better healthcare, not bans on treatment, and she thinks it's a mistake to ignore their voices. It's also quite strange because this episode also featured an interview with a patient who was treated according to the WPATH guidelines of affirming but careful care.
Is your life better?
My quality of life has improved drastically. I very much believe if I hadn't done all of these things, there's a high likelihood I would have tried to take my own life and I might have succeeded.
So it's a little weird seeing conservatives share the clips only featuring the anecdotes of those who regretted transition. What about the anecdotes of those who don't regret it? Why do the anecdotes of those who regretted treatment matter more than the anecdotes of those who didn't regret treatment? The real answer is, of course, because one of the anecdotes agrees with the conservatives. And like I said, all conservatives have is anecdotes. Let's go ahead and take a step back from these conservative fifis and look at some facts. There have been long-term systematic reviews of over 50 studies indicating that gender-affirming treatment has an overall positive outcome on average for people struggling with gender dysphoria. Well-done studies using sound methodology and control groups also found that gender-affirming treatment on average benefited the mental health of trans people who desired treatment. Despite these facts, some made fun of me specifically using the clip as evidence that I was wrong when I mentioned studies showing transitioning has a positive effect. This is, of course, an extremely big brain take. As everyone knows, studies indicating a certain treatment has a positive effect means that the treatment is 100% foolproof and never has any issues ever. We're dealing with a genius right here. Special applause for the winner of the Special Olympics. It even featured an extensive interview in the end with an LGBT lawyer and activist who condemned Stahl for the report because of the potential for it to be misconstrued by anti-transgender demagogues.
And the Human Rights Campaign are worried that highlighting the stories of detransitioners could make things worse. Alfonso David is president of the Human Rights Campaign.
We're talking about a community, transgender people that are already marginalized, that are being further marginalized and victimized by elected officials, by anti-equality forces. They're being used as a political football.
So despite the fact that this episode was clearly taking a pro-trans stance and it was focusing on the pitfalls of specific clinics failing to meet the WPATH guidelines, it may have sort of backfired, largely due to the response from conservatives. More specifically, everyone's favorite chuckle fuck, Tucker Carlson. Tucker used this episode as a proxy to claim that Google and Facebook are pushing out propaganda designed to increase the feelings of gender dysphoria, and that gender dysphoria is more common now because of the internet. Let's be objective here. Research has indicated that sometimes social media can play a role in causing people to erroneously believe that they are suffering from gender dysphoria when it may actually be something else. But this is why good healthcare and trained professionals following the WPATH guidelines is so important to help those who may be erroneously believing they have gender dysphoria to recognize the true underlying issue. Secondly, I'm not even sure what he's talking about. Like, gender dysphoria has been documented long before the internet, and part of the reason we're seeing an increase in people with gender dysphoria seeking help is because it's more socially acceptable. Of course, this is obvious. This happens all the time historically. Look at interracial marriage. I know this isn't a one-to-one comparison, but it does show that as something becomes more socially acceptable, it becomes more common. In this case, being trans is becoming more acceptable, no thanks to losers like Tucker Carlson, so it would logically follow that those who feel they may be suffering from gender dysphoria would pursue treatment. Lastly, if this was largely being motivated by social media or peer pressure, wouldn't we see really high regret rates? When we talk about regret rates, conservatives may throw around studies indicating large amounts of trans youth will grow out of their identity as they get older. However, it's important to look at the methodology of these studies because most of them are using referrals, not individuals actually diagnosed with gender dysphoria. When you adjust for who actually has dysphoria, the majority of trans youth go on to transition later in life, and of the 13.1% that didn't, the reasons ranged from discrimination, family pressure, and vulnerability to violence. Older cohorts conservatives will sometimes cite to indicate exaggerated desistance rates are also extremely flawed. This school of thought holds that because the criteria for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, previously called gender identity disorder, was less stringent in the past, the earlier desistance studies included a large cohort of children who today would not be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Gay boys who may have been experimenting with different ways of expressing gender, but who were really never transgender in the first place. The methodology of those studies is very flawed because they didn't study gender identity. This proves that when the guidelines are actually being followed, these clinics are doing their job, weeding out who actually has gender dysphoria and dismissing those who don't. If anything, this is a good thing. In a 2015 survey of nearly 28,000 people conducted by the US-based National Center for Transgender Equality, only 8% of respondents reported detransitioning, and 62% of those people said they only detransitioned temporarily. The most common reason for detransitioning, according to the survey, was pressure from a parent, while only 0.4% of respondents said they detransitioned after realizing transitioning wasn't right for them. The results of a 50-year survey published in 2010 of a cohort of 767 transgender people in Sweden found that about 2% of participants expressed regret after undergoing gender-affirming surgery. One study thoroughly surveyed doctors all over the world who had registered for WPATH conferences. All the doctors combined had treated over 22,000 transgender patients. The study concluded regret after gender-affirming surgery is an exceedingly rare event. Reasons for regret or detransition are diverse, ranging from change in gender identity to societal and relationship pressures to post-surgical pain. Lastly, it's extremely important to talk about clinics that are not abiding by the guidelines, but when you take a broader look, it's pretty clear that this also doesn't seem to be happening on a massive scale. A study of the practices of 12 gender clinics in a diversity of settings found minimal risk of regret and no known cases of malpractice suits. So in short, this cuck is wrong. Ultimately, this episode featured an important discussion about trans healthcare, how it needs to be improved, and how Republican efforts to cut healthcare for trans people only makes detransitioners a more likely phenomena. I really wish this episode wasn't misconstrued and maligned by malicious maniacs who just hate trans people, but sadly, It was. I really wish we could just have a good discussion without these emotional conservatives getting triggered and shutting down good and reasonable dialogue. Honestly, feels bad, man. Please give this video a like, comment below, subscribe to the channel. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you all soon. Peace.